Welcome to Apropos. Tehran is rejecting the claims as baseless. Authorities in Sweden have accused Iran of hacking into a text messaging service last year and sending thousands of messages urging Swedes to take revenge on protesters who'd burned the Koran. The aim, they say, was to create division and the impression that Sweden was an Islamophobic nation. On several occasions last year, individuals set fire to Islam's holy book in public, prompting outrage in the Muslim world and raising fears of attacks by jihadists. Selina Sykes has more.
The aim was to create division in Swedish society. The words of Swedish prosecutors on Tuesday as they accused Iran's intelligence service of hacking a phone operator last year to send some 15,000 messages encouraging people to take revenge on protesters who had burned the Quran. Violent riots broke out in Sweden last year after several anti-Islam activists set fire to copies of the Islamic holy book. Sweden's intelligence service said it had determined a hacker group called Anzu, who had acted on behalf of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard to carry out an influence campaign. Sweden's Justice Minister said he considered Iran to be one of the country's greatest security threats.
The fact that a state actor, in this case Iran, is behind an action aimed at destabilising Sweden or increasing polarisation in our country is, of course, very serious.
Iran was quick to dismiss the accusations.
The Embassy of the Islamic Republic of Iran in Stockholm considers the accusations to be baseless and rejects them.
At the time, Sweden's government condemned the Koran burnings and police tried to ban them, but they were allowed by courts under freedom of expression laws. The incidents also sparked outrage in several Middle Eastern countries.
To discuss further, we're joined now by Rouzbeh Parsi. He's head of the Middle East and North Africa programme at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Thank you so much for being with us on the programme this evening. So the Swedish Justice Minister described these accusations against Iran as very serious, saying the attacks were aimed at increasing polarisation. Would that be in line with Iranian policy here in Europe? And with authorities saying that it's unlikely that any charges will be brought, what can be done to counter such campaigns?
Well, I think it's first important to remember that this is, of course, something that is based on opportunism. That is, that those divisions do exist in Sweden and that the Iranian authorities or intelligence services saw an opportunity to try and widen them. And so in that sense, the situation existed and they saw an opportunity to escalate it. Now, the question is, why would they do this? Obviously, 15,000 text messages isn't going to change anything in Sweden. And as far as the authorities know, no one really took those messages to heart and did anything. But of course, the more important question is, how did they manage to do this and what they wanted to achieve? And I think partly it was, as you mentioned in the report, that they want to be able to say that we're holding Islam's flag high and that these Western countries are basically Islamophobic.
And what kind of wider impact did all of this have? The protests that we saw in Sweden, relations between Stockholm and Tehran, they had already been strained.
Yes, so in that sense, this is follows on several other things that Swedish authorities now accuse Iranian authorities of doing. And this partly also then ties into the fact that Iran has taken several Swedish citizens and used them as bargaining chips in order to get one person freed out of Swedish jail. So there was a prisoner exchange, and there are these hacking attacks, and there are other things that Iranian intelligence services are accused of being doing, like, for instance, trying to enroll mafia gangs in Sweden to do their bidding.
Now, all of this happened before the election of Iran's new president. We've seen him give his first address there to the UN General Assembly. Are we seeing at all a different kind of tone coming from Iran since his election?
Well, I think when it comes to foreign policy in general, he has some power, so he can modulate the basic line that the system in Iran pursues. But when it comes to these intelligence operations, I'm not so sure that any Iranian president has much say, because the security establishment in this respect is quite autonomous.
And he did, during that address, he signalled, and he has previously, a willingness to reopening nuclear negotiations with the West. Do you think during his visit to the US that he's going to be trying to convince Washington to lift those Trump-imposed sanctions that were imposed on Iran when it exited the nuclear deal?
Yes, but this is a very complicated issue. It's complicated because it's the legislature, that is Congress, who has enacted these sanctions. So an American president cannot lift them on his own. He can only use executive orders to give, in a sense, exemptions from them. And to get US Congress to change that is going to be an almost impossible task, and it would take years. So that's one issue. The issue that we have in Europe and the Americans have with Iran is, besides the nuclear program, is the support Iran has given to Russia in the war in Ukraine. So there are several other outstanding issues that need somehow to be resolved. And on top of that is the fact that neither the Americans nor now the Iranians believe that the previous nuclear agreement is any longer viable. So they would then have to, in a sense, not go back to the old deal as much as try and negotiate a totally new one.
And during that address, the Iranian president, he also called for dialogue, not just in the Middle East, but also to resolve the war in Ukraine. But Iran, it's accused of supporting Russia by supplying drones and even missiles. So there is a contradictory element in what, on one hand, Iran is saying and what it's actually accused of doing.
Well, yes. I mean, obviously, you can say it's a contradiction, but it's also a question of realpolitik. That is, Iran needs allies. And since Europe is not going to be an ally, which was clear once Trump enacted those sanctions that are still in place on Iran, the Iranians obviously need to make sure that they do have some friends. And what they cannot afford is to become an enemy of Russia, since it is a very important neighbor. And so it's a marriage of convenience fueled by their own interests, but also partly because, as far as Tehran is concerned, there is no hope in Brussels or Paris or London or Berlin for any change anytime soon.
And in Stockholm as well this week, the government there is describing Iran as the country that poses one of the greatest threats to Sweden, and that is despite the election of this more reformist, more moderate president. So they're warning as well about, there's increasingly aggressive tactics that we're going to continue to see. Is that something that you would agree with as well?
Yes, I mean, I think at least there is a baseline here that is going to be very, very difficult to get away from. And that is that Iran and Europe and the US have basically, since Trump enacted sanctions in 2018, increasingly been on a collision course, which was exacerbated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Iranian support to Russia. And so all of these outstanding issues are now being fed into a narrative of almost a kind of a Cold War #2 with Russia and China and Iran as a very junior partner. And this can, of course, become a self-fulfilling prophecy if politicians on all sides don't try and find a way of opening diplomatic channels and actually negotiating on the outstanding issues.
Rouzbeh, we'll have to leave it there for now, but thank you so much for your time on the programme this evening. That's Rouzbeh Parsi, Head of the Middle East and North Africa Programme at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Well, civilians are continuing to